Old Jim, a solitary fisherman living by the frigid bay, was setting his nets at dawn when he spotted a figure struggling in the water. Without hesitation, he plunged straight into the fierce current. The man he pulled out was freezing and unconscious but revealed a faded military tattoo on his left shoulder. They exchanged barely a word, and the next morning, Navy officers stepped onto Jim's wooden pier. "Would you stop to help in that situation? Type 11 if you too would choose to do the right thing." Jim had lived alone for nearly 15 years since his wife passed. A man of few words, he survived by fishing, keeping to himself, avoiding the complications of human connection. That morning, the mist still heavy over the water, Jim Walker's weathered hands worked methodically, mending nets before the day's catch. His small cabin perched on weathered stilts at the edge of Cooper's Bay, far enough from town that visitors were rare, just how he preferred it. The morning light was painting the horizon in amber when he heard a faint cry carried across the water. Jim squinted through the fog. About 50 yards out, arms thrashed against the current. A head disappeared under the surface, then emerged gasping. Thoughts flashed through his mind, probably some drunk who fell off a pleasure boat. Could be trouble, I don't need. The current's strong today, but his body moved before his mind finished deliberating. Jim dropped his nets, kicked off his boots, and dove into the frigid waters. The shock of cold seized his chest as he fought against the pull of the tide. He navigated diagonally, letting the flow carry him toward the struggling figure. "Hold on," he shouted, his voice barely carrying over the water's rush. The man was going under again when Jim reached him. He grabbed a fistful of sodden jacket, hauling upward. With one arm locked across the man's chest, Jim kicked hard toward shore. Every stroke felt like moving through concrete. His muscles screamed, but the shoreline inched closer. The stranger wasn't breathing. Jim rolled him onto his side, pounding between his shoulder blades. Nothing. He turned the man over, placed interlocked hands on his sternum, and began compressions. "Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Not on my beach. Not today." After what seemed an eternity, the man convulsed, water spewing from his mouth. A ragged gasp followed. Jim sat back on his heels, his own breathing labored. Once the stranger could sit up, Jim helped him to the cabin. Inside, he stoked the wood stove, wrapped the man in his thickest blanket, and put coffee on to boil. When he helped the shivering man out of his soaked shirt, Jim noticed a faded tattoo across the left shoulder blade. USN with an insignia he vaguely recognized from his own brief stint in the service decades ago. Not just any insignia, one reserved for high-ranking officers. The stranger caught Jim studying the mark. "Thank you," the man said simply when his voice returned. "I won't trouble you further." "You need a hospital," Jim replied. "No," the word came sharp and certain. "No hospitals, no reports." By nightfall, the stranger had recovered enough strength to stand. "I need to go," he insisted. Though the wind had picked up outside, Jim merely nodded, packing him some food in an old paper bag. "No questions asked." The man paused at the door. "Few would have done what you did," Jim shrugged. "Anyone would." "No," the man said with certainty. "They wouldn't." He disappeared into the darkness. Jim stood alone on his wooden pier, watching the stranger's footprints slowly vanish in the gathering fog, wondering what storm he'd just pulled from the sea. "If you believe a good person deserves to be remembered, stay here with us." By midday, word had spread through the small coastal town of Portside. Old Jim pulled someone from the bay at dawn. In a community where fishing tales grew larger with each retelling, this one traveled with unusual speed. Jim noticed the stares when he docked his small boat to sell the morning's modest catch. "Heard you played hero this morning," said Russ, the market manager, counting bills into Jim's calloused palm. "Just helped someone who needed it," Jim replied. "Mighty brave," Russ continued, leaning close. "Who was he?" "Didn't ask." Jim pocketed the money and turned to leave. But rumors spread faster than truth in small towns. By afternoon, the speculation had transformed. "That old hermit's hiding something," whispered Dolores at the general store. "Nobody just falls into the bay at dawn." "Probably smugglers," her husband agreed. "Remember those drug busts up north last summer?" What began as curious glances turned to suspicious stares. People who normally ignored Jim now watched with deliberate attention. Some crossed the street when they saw him coming. 2 days later, Malcolm Pierce, who owned the marina where Jim rented his small docking space, approached with an uncomfortable expression. "Jim," he began, rubbing his neck, "got a situation here." Jim waited silently. "Town's on edge with all this talk. Coast Guard's been asking questions. I can't afford complications." Malcolm avoided Jim's eyes. "I think it's best if you moved your boat elsewhere. Just temporarily, you understand." Jim looked at the spot his boat had occupied for 11 years, then at Malcolm, who'd once shared fishing beers with him when they were younger men. "I understand," he said quietly. He gathered his few belongings from the small locker he kept at the marina: extra tackle, a spare jacket, a photograph of his wife, Sarah, smiling from the deck of their first boat together. He didn't argue or explain. Jim moved his boat back to the old abandoned pier near his cabin, a longer walk, less protected from storms, but it was his own. That evening, as he mended a torn net by lamplight, he wondered how a single act of decency could become so twisted. 3 days passed in silence. Then on the fourth morning, an envelope appeared, wedged in the crack of his cabin door. No postmark, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Thank you for not asking questions. If you ever need anything, call this number." Below was a string of digits, and at the bottom, an inscription. CDR, Atlantic Command. Jim folded the letter carefully, tucking it into the wooden box where he kept Sarah's last letter, written from the hospital before cancer claimed her. The following Saturday, Jim ventured into town for supplies. As he waited for his order at the hardware store, a man in a worn veteran's cap caught his eye from across the counter. Walker, the man called Bill Thornton, who'd served in the Gulf decades ago. "Heard you fished out more than cod the other morning," Bill said, voice low. Jim merely nodded. "That tattoo you mentioned to Russ, was it shaped like an eagle clutching an anchor with 3 stars above?" Jim hadn't mentioned any tattoo to anyone, but rumors had their own life. "Might have been," Jim allowed cautiously. Bill leaned closer. "That's not just any Navy ink. I saw that mark once on an admiral visiting our carrier group. But here's the thing," he glanced around, before continuing. "The man who wore it, Admiral Harrison, was reported missing 6 months ago. Some kind of classified operation gone wrong." Jim's face revealed nothing, but his mind raced as he walked back to his pier. The weight of something larger than he'd imagined, pressing down on his shoulders. A week later, dawn was just breaking, when Jim heard footsteps on his creaking wooden pier. He'd been awake for an hour, repairing a damaged trawling line, his movements illuminated by an old kerosene lamp. He looked up to see 3 figures approaching perfectly aligned, moving with the disciplined gait that instantly identified them, even before the rising sun revealed their immaculate naval uniforms. The lead officer, a tall woman with commander's insignia, stepped forward and offered a formal salute. "Mr. James Walker, we're from Naval Command Headquarters." Jim slowly set down his net needle, wiping rough hands on his pants as he stood. "That's me. Sir, we'd like to request your presence at the North Harbor Naval Facility." Her tone was respectful, not demanding. "This is not mandatory, but it would be greatly appreciated." "What's this about?" he asked. "I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to discuss details here," she replied. "But I can assure you, you're not in any trouble." Quite the opposite. The naval base was 40 minutes by car, hidden behind high fences along a secluded stretch of coastline. Security was tight, IDs checked, vehicle inspected, escorts assigned. They led him to an unmarked building near the water's edge. Inside a small conference room, a man in full dress uniform entered. Jim recognized him immediately, the same face he'd pulled from the bay, now transformed by the crisp white uniform and quiet confidence of command. "Mr. Walker," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Rear Admiral Thomas Harrison. We've met under less formal circumstances." Harrison gestured to a chair. "What I'm about to tell you is classified, but you've earned the right to know." As they settled, Harrison began. 6 months ago, I was leading an internal investigation into supply chain corruption. Military equipment disappearing, showing up in places it shouldn't be. I uncovered evidence implicating several high-ranking officials. The Admiral's expression darkened. 3 weeks before you found me, I was ambushed during a supposedly secure transport. My security detail was compromised. I was drugged, taken aboard a vessel, and disposed of. They assumed the currents would carry me out to sea." Jim listened, his weathered face revealing nothing. "I managed to stay afloat longer than they anticipated, drifting in and out of consciousness. Then you appeared." Harrison leaned forward. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't ask questions. You simply acted when action was needed." The room fell silent, save for the distant sound of waves against the shore. Harrison placed a hand on Jim's shoulder. "We've apprehended the individuals responsible, but this experience has revealed a troubling ethical gap in our ranks. Too many people following orders, without questioning their moral implications." A different officer stepped forward, an older man with Admiral stars. "Mr. Walker, we'd like to offer you a position as a civilian ethics consultant for our officer training program. Not as military personnel, but as someone who understands that doing the right thing transcends protocol." Jim's eyebrows rose slightly, the most surprise he'd shown in years. "I'm just a fisherman," he said quietly. "Exactly," Harrison replied. "A fisherman who didn't hesitate to risk his life for a stranger, who asked no questions, demanded no reward. sought no recognition. These are the values we're trying to instill. The senior admiral cleared his throat. We've also looked into the marina situation. Pierce has received an official reprimand for his actions. Your docking privileges have been reinstated should you wish to return. Jim thought of Malcolm's uncomfortable expression. The whispers in town, the cross street. I prefer my own pier, he said. Where I belong. Harrison nodded with understanding. Of course, but know that you have options now. As the meeting concluded, Harrison led Jim to the window. Below, at the docks, a sleek patrol vessel was moored, smaller than the massive ships further out, but impressive nonetheless. That's the USS Integrity, Harrison said, commissioned just last month. Tomorrow, she sails on her first patrol. He turned to Jim. We'd be honored if you would join us for the ceremony as our guest of honor. Jim watched the sailors moving purposefully across the deck, the flag snapping in the breeze. For the first time in years, something inside him stirred a feeling of connection to something larger than himself. I'll think about it, he said, which was more commitment than he'd given anyone in years. Before dawn the next morning, a military vehicle rolled quietly down the dirt road, leading to Jim's cabin. Unlike yesterday's formal procession, this was a single jeep, its headlights cutting through the lingering darkness. A young sailor stepped out, carrying something carefully folded in his arms. He approached the cabin with reverent steps, placing the bundle on the weathered porch steps. No knock, no announcement. He simply stood at attention for a moment, saluted the house, then departed as quietly as he had come. When Jim opened his door an hour later, coffee mug in hand, he found a perfectly folded American flag in a triangular display case. Beside it lay a small brass plaque reading, "You don't need to boast, but your country knows who you are." Jim's weather-worn face cracked into a small smile, the kind he'd almost forgotten how to make. He adjusted his glasses, picked up the flag with unexpected tenderness, and looked out toward the sea that had defined his existence for so long. As he stood there, young Tommy from the neighboring property, a curious 8-year-old who occasionally helped Jim sort his catch, came wandering down the path. The boy stopped, noticing the flag in Jim's hand. Without prompting or explanation, Tommy straightened his posture and placed his hand over his heart, just as they'd taught him in school. Jim nodded at the boy, acknowledging his gesture. No grand ceremony, no applause, no speeches, but throughout that day, something shifted in Port's. Word spread, as it always did, but differently this time. Jim noticed it when he went into town for supplies. The whispers had changed from suspicion to something like respect. Malcolm Pierce approached him outside the general store, shuffling uncomfortably. Heard about what really happened, he said, extending his hand. Your spot at the marina, it's still there if you want it. Jim shook the offered hand but said, I'm content where I am. That evening, as the sun set in spectacular hues across the bay, Jim sat on his pier, pipe in hand. A small patrol boat passed in the distance, and Jim noticed it change course slightly, moving closer to his pier. As it passed, the sailors on deck stood at attention, facing his humble dock. One raised a hand in salute. Jim stood slowly, straightening his bent frame as much as his years allowed. He didn't salute back. He was no military man, but he raised his hand in simple acknowledgement. One sailor to another, across the divide of water. That night, for the first time in years, Jim removed Sarah's photograph from the drawer, where he kept his sparse treasure. He placed it on the small table beside his bed, her smile illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the window. You'd have done the same, he told her quietly. You always knew when doing right mattered more than being safe. Jim Walker wasn't just a fisherman anymore. He had become proof that righteousness needs no explanation. It only requires action. Have you ever done the right thing, only to suffer for it? Share your story. It deserves to be heard too. Subscribe, so YouTube can suggest something righteous to you every day, even when the world forgets. That dawn, as the sun spilled across Timberline Ranch, Miles stood by the gate, boots dusty, hands trembling. He hadn't given to be remembered. But in that moment, as black SUVs lined the dirt road, he realized something bigger had taken root. In a world where silence often answers need, his voice had been action, and that made all the difference.